The BRM Café podcast is produced by Lead the Pack Consulting.
Welcome to BRM Café. I'm your host, Peter Lijnse, and my guest today is Megan Diehm. And Megan has spent her career in the space where strategy either gains traction or quietly dies, bridging executive vision and real-world execution across transformation portfolios. Megan lived the reality most of us know well, doing the work of organizational relationship management under a dozen different titles and having to articulate its value without a shared language to lean on. Megan, welcome to BRM Café. Really glad you're here. Anything you want to add to this intro?
Hi, Peter. And no, that sounded great. Really excited to be here with you today.
Great. Well, welcome. Let's dig in. And I have to explain this that we met each other really through LinkedIn. You posted something, I posted something, and then we started talking about that. So I really want to discuss some of your the things you have posted, and I'm very interested in your perspective around relationship management in organizations. So one thing is, you started in one of your posts, you described BRM as less of a role and more of an organizational force. When you look back at your own career, was there a specific moment where you felt that force, where you could see it creating real momentum than just managing a process?
Yes. So what I mean by that is when you start to think about a relationship sounds soft. However, the way that relationship shows up in creating alignment and clarity and actually driving decisions and execution that results in outcomes is where I think is the sweet spot of really how you see those relationships showing up. It's not necessarily the work, but how the work gets achieved. Maintaining those conversations throughout helps to inform people and keep people focused on what are we working towards and what are we getting out of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. When you look at because you mentioned here something around organizational relationship management, in a way, and that's how I normally describe it, is business relationship management or the relationship management skills are a means to an end. And you mentioned that in your outcomes. And for me, it's quite often more important to talk about collaboration to get results. And you use relationships to collaborate. Have you seen that as well?
Yes, I have. One of the things that I think has been so pivotal to changing the dynamics of the culture is when you start to work with different leaders often tend to be very focused on what their responsibilities are, what their outcomes are, how their measurables show up in the whole of the organization. They rarely tend to think about the group at large, what their piece in the greater vision really is. And so when you start to have a conversation about, oh, you're working on this, here's how this would impact this team, or here's what that would inform in the organization, and this is how it shows up in vision and strategy. It helps to change the dynamics of the conversation. It's less about them going down one path and more about everybody rowing together. And that helps to really unify teams and bring people a shared understanding of what's important in an organization.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that as fragmentation. You called it fragmentation, I think, in one of your posts. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I think fragmentation is where different managers have very specific, or leaders have very specific ownerships over their components of a business. So here's a great example. You look at finance. Finance's responsibility is they want to increase revenue and reduce cost. How do they do that? When you're looking at a spreadsheet and everything's a line item, it's very easy to just draw lines without understanding what the impact is of that line item, correct? So when you start to say, okay, here's what we're doing, and we start to shift necessarily that away from that line item and give that line item context. We shift away from something like utilization to consumption. Are you using a program to the best of its ability in the way that it can really serve your business well? Or are you just opening it and using it for this one widget section of the tool. And that helps you really start to realize how all of these business components are integrated to achieve the holistic goal. But when you have that fragmentation and everyone's really heads down on their own stuff, they tend to forget about the whole. And that's where you start to see some decisions, financial decisions that organizationally don't make sense, but do make sense for that one area happen on repeat.
That's where you get the tension between different business units because they get evaluated based on certain performance criteria that create tension because they want to do this and another group wants to do that. That doesn't make sense from a corporate perspective, but hey, that's how they're being measured. So yes, so you did something interesting at the start of your answer that I want to come back to. You said managers, and then you quickly changed it to leaders.
Yes. So one of the things that I have recognized is there is a distinct difference between a manager and a leader. A leader tends to be more holistic in their thinking. They are more of a visionary. They understand how they fit, but they also are responsible for the outcomes. Managers tend to be very myopic in terms of process and checking a box, holding people accountable for this, this, and this. They don't question the why we're doing it this way. It's we've done it this way. This is what I need. Reduce it by X amount. Less about how we achieve it and more about a dictation.
So great point from that perspective. If I go on further with that, would you see that? Okay, who would be more helped with understanding relationship management? Because if I look at how you describe this, they both need relationship management to understand that, but from a different perspective. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing is number one, understand who you're working with. Understand their style and the way that they measure success, right? So there is going to be a different in focus from a leader versus a manager or something like that. Somebody with a big team with a huge revenue, things like that. After you understand who they are and what drives them, then you need to be agile in the way that you support them. Support doesn't look the same for everybody, and it is not a one size fits all. When you start to recognize that somebody is more of a manager, getting them to help you understand the why behind some of the decisions they're making. So that's where you start to lead with a lot of probing questions. I recognize that your goals are X, Y, and Z. How are you achieving them? What has been your success rate? What in the past was a barrier to success? How can I support you? You start to really make sure that you see their goals and you support them through it. The biggest change that I would say between somebody who is a true leader and a manager is that leader is going to say, okay, this worked really well for us. I'd love to dig in and see how it could help the whole.
Yep. I personally think that anyone in the organization can be a leader. Yeah, it's at any moment in time. Even if you're in an operational role and you work in a team, you can still step up in that leadership role. Manager is quite often more assigned. You have people reporting to you, etc. Now, in your roles, and you talk in some of your blog articles. You talk very much around the link between strategy and results and how to focus on that. You mentioned a couple of times outcomes, etc. here, but also you mentioned now the fact is that sometimes we focus too close on only what we need to do, and we need to expand that. So my question to you is if you look at an organization and you would come into an organization, what would you do to be able to get to that full picture that of outcomes, etc.? How would you help people? Because there's a little bit of coaching involved, and I hear you kind of like that coaching role to actually help organizations to move through. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, you nailed it. That's one of my passions right there. So really what I want to do when I meet a new business unit or I am just starting a conversation is I want to listen. I'm going to ask a lot of questions about where are you today? How are things going? What's working? What isn't working? But more, I want to talk about the art of the possible. So we're going to remove all the constraints. We're not going to say, I only have 10 people. That's hard, all of those things. What I want to do is really hear from you. If there were no constraints in 5 years, what would you want to be able to achieve? And then from there, I start to break it down. So it's like that 5, 3, and then the 1. And what I want to do is help them understand there's different tracks to achieving that goal, right? So you take that beautiful vision and you break it down and synthesize it into smaller steps that help you eat the elephant. You're not just going to go achieve that tomorrow, but what you can do is break it down in a way that achieves the goal over time. And the biggest thing I would say that I would do different than most is I'm going to break it into two separate tracks. One is strategic and one is business continuity. What do you need to do to maintain today? And where can we invest to achieve tomorrow? And that differentiation helps to take some of the pressure off, right? Because sometimes people see this goal as very unattainable. I've made purchases before, I bought this system, we do this thing, and it didn't really achieve what we thought it would do. Now, why did it not achieve? Sometimes that's less of a technology challenge and more of a people and process. But you also have to be willing to say the hard thing because often people don't push back. They don't challenge to understand. They receive direction without truly understanding the bigger impact of that direction. And so I always try to tell people if you are in a meeting and you have a question or there's something about it that just isn't sitting right with you, you don't have to know why, but you are responsible for asking questions to understand. Because if you're wondering, somebody else has to be wondering too. And your perspective is important. Even if you don't think, well, they're the manager, they're the team lead, they're the whatever. But here's the thing, you're in that seat for a reason. Your perspective matters, or you wouldn't have been invited into that meeting. So it's your responsibility to help educate and help everyone understand how this will impact the whole.
It's very much an helping people to collaborate, yeah, what we talked about earlier, but also making sure that we create opportunities, we create um, a way for people to contribute at a time sometimes where it's difficult for them. And I recognize, I mean, people behave differently based on their own capabilities, yeah, their own strengths and weaknesses, the way you actually approach things, or even context that they're in. But sometimes you need to bring them out. But it's also difficult, I think, to get people to um, share information if they're not ready for it, or if they're a little bit struggling with capturing their thoughts clearly and how to do that. And that's I think the navigation that we quite often have to do to be able to pull that out, but without putting people on the spot where they feel uncomfortable. And that's I think the balancing act you quite often actually go through.
Yeah, that's an art, right? So I think that people who have strong EQ can often pinpoint when somebody is either disagreeing whether or not they say it, or something, they have a question and they're digesting something. So even if they aren't going to speak up, what I do try to do is say, hey, wanted to check in with you. I recognize that this is a process that you're very close to. Wanted to get your thoughts and dialogue on what we discussed and ways that you think we could improve or shift. I am somebody who does not fail well, but I am the queen of a pivot. And the difference between a pivot and a fail is failing, you're not achieving your outcome. A pivot means we recognize that what we were going towards wasn't the right priority. And so that's where I do think as individuals who are invested in other individuals' success as a BRM or organizational relationship manager, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, what you're really doing is empowering people to achieve what it is that you're trying to, as an organization, achieve. I'm not wanting you to achieve it because it looks good for me. I want you to achieve it because this is the route and this is the way that we're going to show up well for the community, for our discipline, for our industry, all of those pieces, right? So I look at the value and the impact. And oftentimes people get a bit in their own way because they're nervous to bring it up, right? But if you take some of that pressure down, oh, I also heard from so and so, he had a bit of a concern around this. This is how this would show up and potentially impact XYZ. They're like, I agree with that. Here, did you consider this? That helps you change the conversation. I've also seen in different areas of organizations where there is a bit of a disconnect from, you know, leader to where the work gets done. They need a report and people get them the report. They don't really dig into how the sausage is made, if you will. And the challenge there is when you're working only with those leaders and executive suite, you tend to not recognize the pieces underneath of how that change will impact daily business continuity. And that's really important when you're starting to really build a vision that will achieve the outcome, right? So if you think back to when I said I've got those two tracks, you get the vision, but then you really have to understand what the impact of that so you don't disrupt the business operations day to day too much, right? Disruption is good to some extent, but you still need to make sure you're able to achieve your goals.
Yeah. So it's very, very interesting how you approach this, but I think it's the right approach. The danger, I think, and this is where I normally look at with a lot of people that are in a relationship management role. Doesn't matter what kind of role it is, if they call business partner, engagement manager, business relationship manager. There's lots of different titles, but a lot of them have a lot of experience from what they've done in the past. And I think when you talked about failure, when you talk about, okay, we need to have that business continuity, it is, I think, very tempting and for a lot of people to step into a role and then just do it. Okay, let me then just fix it instead of getting other people to do it that should do it. And for me, that is a very difficult balance, because I normally tell people, especially in the business relationship manager role, they're their own worst enemy. They want to do all the execution, and they also want to do strategy, but execution consumes everything. And I've told them on a regular basis, if it's safe to fail, let it fail. What is your reaction to that?
That's hard for me to swallow. Now, I've heard that a lot. I don't disagree with you. Where I would challenge is really in why is it failing? Some of that tends to be that the BRM jumps in and then I call it spackle, behaves as spackle and tries to kind of fill in the gaps. I don't want you to fill in the gaps. I want you to recognize them and raise those flags so that we can hold the right people accountable. That isn't failing. That is holding process and people accountable. And I know you're laughing, but it might be a little bit of a rebrand, if you will.
Yep. No, I saw the hurt basically in your nonverbal communication.
Don't like to just be like, well, guess what? The house is on fire. We're just going to watch it burn, right? I want to throw water on it immediately. However, there is a time where some of it, you should smell some smoke, right? And when you smell smoke, what do you do next? Because if you don't take a moment to, hold on, is that smoke? You don't give people an opportunity to, one, level up and skill up. You also don't give them an opportunity to recognize risk and challenges and problems, because they may have noticed that this was starting to slip but they didn't bring it forward because they weren't sure the scale and the scope of what the impact of that would be. And so that's where, for me personally, that has been a true growth opportunity throughout my career because, the firefighter, jump in, we don't fail, let's get it done girl is who I have always been kind of at the core. But also recognizing when are we getting it done and when are we covering the actual problem? And that's different. And it's really hard to recognize the difference, but you need to be extremely intentional about it.
Okay, I'm just going to see if I can play a bit of a role here.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, you want us to do all these different kind of things. We have so many priorities. We're way too busy. Yes, of course, things are failing, but that's because we have 10,000 other things to do. So how are you going to help us with that then? I mean, just do that.
What I would say is if everything is your number one priority, nothing's your priority. The reality is you have to have some sort of sequencing.
Yes.
And that's where governance and structure, decisions, and alignment is really, really important because I believe that when people are kind of running around with their hair on fire, oh, we've got all this on our plate, we can't do this. Okay, let's turn down the noise. And what is the real challenge that you're navigating here? That's the first indicator to me that this is the boiling point and less about what they're actually experiencing. And so you got to take a moment to kind of listen and understand the whole of what's happening.
Yes. I appreciate that answer. I mean, I was just pushing that a little bit, but I
see it every day. That was a big deal. We don't have enough time. We don't have people. We've got this, we've got that. And the reality is they're not wrong. All of those things are important. But if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. And so you really do have to have some intentionality around helping them understand some of this can wait. It feels critical, but not everything is an emergency.
Yeah.
And how can we start to differentiate?
Brings me back memories of tabletop exercises and simulation days I did, and one of those things was always like round one was always chaos and everyone was complaining and everyone said we're way too busy, etc. By the time you get to round four, everything feels better, and I often got to comment, okay, but you gave us less work, and I had something like, no. You were more efficient with doing it. I actually gave you more work, but you didn't notice it. And I think that's the difference.
Yes.
If it's chaotic, if there's no processes, you lose a lot of time. You lose a lot of efficiencies. And the moment those efficiencies are there, it actually comes back. Now, I want to switch a little bit to relationship management. What is something you believe about relationship management, about working with people, collaborating, etc., that others in the field or in your organization might push back on?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think people tend to assume that you need to know a little bit about everything, be really broad and just a little bit deep. And the reason I think that's a bit of a mistake is you're not truly understanding the scope of their business. I'm not saying you need to be, 200 feet deep or whatever in that specific business, but you need to understand how it fits in the whole. And when people don't understand the bigger picture and they're so myopically focused, you tend to relationships aren't going to change that if people aren't willing to listen. So you've got to be willing to listen. And the other thing I would say is, in my opinion, I believe that the BRM shows up in two distinct kind of ways. One who has the technology background, and then one that's more focused on operations and efficiencies. I think there's a lot of synergy and they both use the same foundations, but how they achieve the outcome is a little bit different. If you think about a BRM who's partnering with legal or finance or HR, they're going to execute very differently than somebody who is representing the IT team with various business units across
Yeah.
the organization.
Yeah. I would actually expand this because one of the things we do, for instance, is not just working with IT BRMs. I'm doing actually a lot of work also outside of that, working with BRMs, for instance, that represent facility management, legal, to the rest of the organization. But I personally think that relationship management can be a C-level um, executive focus, where you build relationships with any department in an organization. So you can have sales and marketing and operations that need to work together, and sometimes they don't work together well, and that has nothing to do with technology. That has nothing to do with what we do. We're talking about people, and for me, people need to work together. Doesn't matter what kind of silos we have. I mean,
Right.
and if I look at different business units that do not work together, I don't think necessarily we need to have like in IT, for instance, someone that says, okay, I'm a BRM for IT, and I work with these different business units. I think there's BRM roles that, or a leadership role that helps people work together, collaborate. And I think that is, for me, the important part of relationship management. That's why I quite often call it organizational relationship management as well, to take it a little bit out of the IT space. But for me, it's so important. It makes things work. Now, some people say, well, then just build cross-functional teams. And I always say, you have 3 business units and you build a cross-functional team. Guess what? That team becomes a silo automatically.
Yes.
And so we, as humans, somehow we want to build silos. We want to just live within our own team and then basically see the connections with other ones, but we don't expand. And I think that is the nature, maybe, of human nature, where we actually challenge with that.
I would agree with you. Organizational relationship management is, in my opinion, a huge multiplier of productivity, because you are bringing people together to achieve something. And to your point, yeah, you can do a cross functional team or you can do a cross functional meeting, but we've all sat through those, right? Everyone kind of tells you, here's what's going on over here and here's what's happening over here. And it's a book report of your department or your team. It's less about what are we working towards? How are we working together? How is this showing up? Things like that. So having somebody who helps to, one, identify that challenge within the organization, but also helps to bring people together. The other thing I would say is I feel like that is a result of culture a bit, and it starts top down. So if your leadership isn't interested in hearing from other leaders and coming together as a organization, then you're going to struggle in that organization to achieve the goal, regardless of the department. You can be a high performer, an absolute rock star at what you do, but you will not be as successful as you could if you were in a different culture.
You mentioned the term rockstar. I always have to laugh with that. I see a lot of people using it, and I always counter that with a lot of rock stars actually have broken a lot of hotels, etc. Do you really want to be connected to that? But that's just my joke that I normally actually tell.
Broken, you got an opportunity to rebuild, right?
Yeah, I know, but it's they break it a little bit too much sometimes. But and it's a very generalist message as well. But that's yeah. So if you look at organizations and the organizations you worked in as well, if you want to build more relationship management skills in the leadership layers, where would you start?
I would start with quick wins. I would listen first, kind of do the fly on the wall, listen to the different areas and hear some of their pain points. I'd ask questions, and then I would start to investigate how those pain points over here impact what I heard over here. And I would identify a way to quickly get momentum. And then I'd identify something that would require more work. So I'd kind of approach it that we're going to have a quick win. and we're going to have a 6 to 9 month out goal that's going to bring us together. That 6 to 9 month opportunity is going to cultivate an environment where we are a community, we are a team, but that quick win is what's going to get people back to the table, right? So that's going to make them excited, and that's going to drive the commitment that I'm going to need to achieve that secondary item that will then start to fuel a organizational shift in how we start to think and talk to each other and how we look at pain points.
Yeah, because it's kind of interesting because it's sometimes extremely difficult to get people to just sit down and talk to each other. It's just
right.
it's like
common sense, right? Like we talk to people all day, every day. It's the different in the intention behind those conversations. Sometimes people are like, are they asking me this because they want to take this away? What's their intent behind it? That kind of thing. And I've noticed that people get very guarded very quickly about their own work. They take a lot of ownership. And those are people who are usually very passionate about what they do, or they've done it so long, they're not interested in evolving. And it's really important to recognize which one you're working with because how you show up in those instances is going to be different.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. One of the things I like to do with these recordings, basically, is to give you a couple of words, and I want you to react to that, and then we can have a discussion around it in a little bit more detail if you want. But I just want to throw some words at you, and the one that I don't have on my list actually here that I actually got earlier is actually something you just mentioned. So I'm just going to mention the word politics.
Yeah. Noise.
It's noise. Okay.
So, yeah, ego and noise. I think politics gets in the way of goals, and I think it slows things down.
Okay. Yeah, it is. But to be honest, everything is politics nowadays. Everything.
It is, but politics tends to be, this is my fiefdom. Here's what I do. Here's what I bring to it's more ego-based, in my opinion, what I've seen, especially when I look at some of the organizations I've been a part of, even if you extend that to, public sector, things like that, it can be ego. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's how I show up. The reason I think that slows things down is it's not focused on we. It's not focused on serving. It's not leading through their heart. It's, well, I did this. I did that. Look at this. I vote. I own. And it's all about me, me, me. And when you have that me, 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 some politics can be helpful, right? But most of it is noise and very, in my opinion, ego-based.
Yeah, great. That's a great answer. Another word, ambiguity.
Oh, this one is like, ambiguity is challenging for me because when there's ambiguity, I think you lose a lot of momentum and it costs you so much money. And it's money you don't see because you're not actually writing a check for it. Those soft dollars are just being flushed down the toilet. So ambiguity really needs process, decision, some kind of structure so you know where you're going and what you're doing and why you're doing it. When you have that, I'm not saying every process is perfect, but if you have something in a process, you can identify where it's breaking down. But if it's so ambiguous, then you can't create the structure to actually drive the success or achieve what you're trying to work towards.
So another element on this is kind of interesting that you, because I wrote some words down that I normally pick then from at the moment, and my word after ambiguity was momentum, and you started immediately with that. So that's hey, we had the same idea. So I'll pick something else. Let me do this one because before I go in there. Process is great and works very well from a lot of different perspectives. I think in complex environments that sometimes does not always work. I mean, processes need to evolve quite often for complexity. And I link specifically ambiguity to also to complexity, because we don't know really what is happening and we see a lot of different things. So for me, the ambiguity is quite often also linked to complexity. And sometimes indeed processes need to be adjusted. Sometimes we need to change that.
So I agree with you to some extent. However, I would say that in a lot of different arenas, people tend to think that what they do is unique. That it's hard to create a process because everything is so different. The challenge with that is when you have so many snowflakes, you cannot really create some standardization, which is where then your tools can help support you. So even if the process is only 70% of the answer, it's still 70% of the answer, and you've got 30% ambiguity. But you have to start somewhere. And even in complex environments, there are key steps or at least phases that things go through in order to get to the outcome necessary for the process at large, right? Mm-hmm. But if none of that is defined, if someone was hit by a bus tomorrow, what happens to that process? And everyone's like, oh, we'd figure it out, or oh, we'd be so panicked. But that's the point. What if you had 70% of the answer today, and that takes off 70% of the fear, right? And so you're turning down some of that noise. I'm not saying eliminate it altogether. I don't think you can, but you can change the conversation and start to create structure around components of it. And then the rest becomes an art.
Great, awesome. Let's go to a different word. I have two more. Seat at the table is not one word, but it's a statement. Seat at the table.
Yeah, seat at the table. I believe that if you are at the table, you're there on purpose, and it is your responsibility to own that seat. So that means you need to ask questions, participate in the discussion, and you need to raise any concerns at that table. I do not appreciate when there's a conversation and decisions are made, and then there's a meeting after the meeting where someone's like, well, hey, but I get that some people are afraid. However, if you are at that table, you're at the table on purpose, and it is your responsibility to own your voice. And I very much recognize that some of the dynamics of office politics and all of that come into play, but you were there on purpose, and that's your responsibility.
That's great. That's awesome. I always say, if you want to have that seat at the table, don't whine about it like the kid that wants to sit with the adults at the table, because you need to have a purpose. And if they don't see the purpose of you being there, that is their perspective, and you quite often have to accept that, which means you haven't really clearly defined what your role could be when you have that seat at the table. And that's also to start that. I hear people all saying a lot, I need a seat at the table. As I'm like, no, you don't need it. You need to earn it. Yeah, get that seat at the table.
Right. And how do you earn it? You show up.
You
own your voice. You demonstrate your skills, your value, your impact. And then once you're there, people want you to be there. They didn't invite you because they needed a chair filler. That's where you really have to show up. So I get it. People can be scared, but you need to do it scared.
Yes. Okay, last one is always a little bit of a different one that potentially has nothing to do with what we talked about, but you can bring it into that. I'm going to give you this one. Any movie or film that springs to mind at this moment that you say from a relationship management perspective, hey, that's that, or book is fine as well.
Yeah. So I have a 14-year-old daughter, and we have been watching The Summer I Turned Pretty. And one of the things that has been painful about that show and the book was if they would have used their words, we would have had a 1-hour episode versus, 3 seasons. I think that at the end of the day, we see a lot of people afraid to use their words, and then that creates a fun movie or a great book, right? But using your words actually is advocating for yourself and what you want so that you're not wasting time in what could have been. And what I will say about that is please do not shame the you of yesterday with the wisdom of today. You either use your words or you didn't, but don't beat up that younger version of you, because everything else in here, all those words and all the things you tell yourself show up, and how you show up in everyday activities, whether it be at work or with your family, your friends, in your community, things like that. So use your words, and please don't shame the you of yesterday based on the wisdom of today.
It's a great statement. Thank you for that. And I'm in the meantime, I'm thinking about all the things I did wrong in my past life, basically, and I still feel shame about that. Yes. And by the way, the reason why I asked this is kind of an interesting one, because my very first presentation around business relationship management, that was even before the Business Relationship Management Institute was founded, was based on a movie called Driving Miss Daisy. And people have something like, hey, what do you mean by that? And the title of the presentation was Driving Miss Daisy Took Too Long. Yeah, it was a long movie, 30 years or something or more, before they finally had a relationship. And I was like, that's too long. You need to do it faster. So for me, that's...
Use your words.
Yes, indeed, and that was difficult. I mean, if you know the movie, it's a difficult movie, basically from that and in that time frame. But I had some like that. That is indeed, they didn't talk to each other, or they barely talked to each other. They didn't know each other, and it took a long time. And I think that's I think similar to what you just said. So great, awesome, thanks. Well, before I wrap up, and do you have any questions for me?
Questions for you. So when you look at challenges in organizations, is there something specific that you think leaders should recognize as a sign that they need to bring in an organizational relationship manager?
That's a really good question. I think that the sign for a leader is when you see things not working well or even failing due to lack of collaboration. You can, as a leader, step in yourself, but sometimes you need to recognize that can be a full-time task because you have so many different things on the go. You quite often you're working on your strategy and you're trying to get to your execution and your results. And if in your organization there is not a great collaboration, you don't get your results, that is directly affecting you. So sometimes assigning someone very specifically, and it doesn't have to mean full-time, it can also be a part-time role, to say, okay, you are going to focus on helping these groups to collaborate, which means you have to bring them together. Yeah, you have to sit with them, you have to facilitate that. And unfortunately, if you bring them together once, they might really appreciate that. But guess what? You might have to do it 3 or 4 times before they finally start to actually do something. I think that is one of the things I normally focus on. And then the other thing is you assign a relationship manager to a situation where it's important, priority to get results fast. You want to make sure it works well. You don't sign a relationship manager to everything in the organization. And to be honest, that has changed over the last couple of years in my perspective. In the beginning, I had some like, as a BRM team, you need to cover the whole organization, for instance, as an example. And I nowadays have some like, no, you work on the ones that are important at this moment. And that can change. There are certain groups where you need to keep track of. And maybe you can ask another delivery person or another leader or so to actually say, can you keep track of what is going on there? And if there's something going on, let me know. And I think this is why it's so important that overall leadership in any organization. But if I use, for instance, IT as an example, any delivery manager, any support person needs to understand that we always need to be on the lookout for where are we missing the collaborative partnership and what can we do to do that. So my advice to leaders quite often is take a few departments where you are going to assign someone to and say, do this. And start building the relationships there, and you are owning that at that moment, and the rest will need to help you, support you. And then there's certain departments that will come along the way. One of the things I always say, you never have enough business relationship managers. There is always more work than you can handle. So you need to really prioritize, and I think that is important.
It's interesting. I tell my team it's the 80-20 principle. You need to know where 80% of the work is being done, and that's going to be 20% of the departments. And so that's kind of what you're saying there, right? Is you need to be intentional on how you spend your time. When you spend your time chasing everybody, you're not going to get very far. When you're intentional about where you put your focus, but you understand where it needs to go, that 80-20 principle, that's how you really start to build that momentum, especially when it comes to collaboration.
So one last question then. What is your favorite management book right now that is not written by me? Let me be very clear.
Not written by you. I love it. Man, there's so many good ones, but I'm going to go with Speed of Trust.
Okay. Is that from Coffee?
Yeah.
Or what? Yeah. Yes.
I love that book. I think that it is so applicable in so many different areas of your life. And I believe that how you show up at home and how you show up at work should be pretty similar if you have strong character and integrity. And I love how it talks about ways to start to really build that and show up in authentic ways. And also, it talks about how to rebuild, and people don't talk about that enough. There are going to be times where you do make mistakes, and you do need to have a bank of goodwill where you're, okay, we missed the mark here, but how can I show up better over here? And really owning that accountability.
That's great. That's awesome. For trust, by the way, if you want to look more at trust, read the article from Francis Fraze. He's a Harvard business professor on the trust triangle. She's very, very good, and she does a lot of short videos, basically on LinkedIn, etc. as well. Very, very good what she's done. My favorite book at this moment, I have multiple, but I'm working on a lot of different things at this moment. And I read 5 management books at the same time quite often because I can't focus on just one. The one that I recently started reading was Humble Inquiry from Shine, which is around... one of the things that really struck me was that he said, don't ask the questions you know the answer to. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually really good. Sometimes we ask questions and we have already the answer, yeah? And we just want to make sure that the rest also knows that, hey, I asked this great question and now everyone actually is explaining that. And he said, no, ask questions that you don't know the answer to. He said, that is the curiosity you need to have.
Yes, I love that. I love leading with curiosity. I'm a natural, real curious person. I want to understand how it works. So I love when people ask questions. It shows me that they're engaged and they're interested. When they know what the answer is and they're asking me, it feels like, did you listen? Are you understanding what we're working on? That kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Awesome. Great. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Megan, for participating in this podcast. I'm looking forward to have some other conversations with you later on. But thanks everyone for listening to the audience that eventually will see this. I'm looking forward to speaking more with a lot of different people. So if anyone is interested in talking about certain topics, feel free to connect with me. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
This episode is brought to you by Lead the Pack Consulting, leadership coaching for organizational relationship management. We help people to lead and succeed. Contact us for more details.